Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn air carried a peculiar chill that September afternoon in 1994, the kind that whispered warnings nobody in Springfield, Massachusetts was willing to hear. 15-year-old Emily Reynolds hugged her books tighter against her chest as she descended the worn stone steps of Lincoln High School, her honey blonde hair dancing in the breeze. "See you tomorrow, Mem," called her best friend Melissa, waving as she climbed into her mother's station wagon. Emily smiled and waved back. "Don't forget to study for the history tests." She adjusted the strap of her backpack and began her usual 10-minute walk home, a route she'd taken hundreds of times before. The maple trees lining Harrison Street were just beginning to surrender their green for brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Emily loved this time of year when everything seemed suspended between summer's freedom and winter's embrace. What Emily didn't notice was the police cruiser that had slowed to match her pace half a block behind her. At 5:47 p.m., Catherine Reynolds glanced anxiously at the kitchen clock for the third time. Emily was never late, not without calling. A single mother working 2 jobs, Catherine had raised her children to be responsible, especially about checking in. She reached for the phone and dialed Melissa's number. "Hi, Mrs. Anderson, is Emily with Melissa by any chance?" The sinking feeling in Catherine's stomach grew heavier with each call she made. By 6:30 p.m., she had phoned every one of Emily's friends. By 7:15 p.m., she was pacing the worn linoleum of their modest kitchen while her son Jason, a freshman at the local community college, drove around the neighborhood searching for his sister. "I'm calling the police," Catherine declared, her voice trembling as she punched in the numbers. Sheriff William Harrington arrived personally at the Reynolds home by 8 p.m. at 42. He cut an imposing figure, tall with broad shoulders and salt and pepper hair, that lent him an air of distinguished authority. The community respected him deeply. He'd served Springfield for nearly 15 years and knew most residents by name. "Catherine," he said gently, notebook in hand, "tell me everything about Emily's routine today." As Catherine described her daughter, honor student, volleyball team, poetry club, responsible beyond her years, Harrington nodded sympathetically, his deep-set eyes projecting concern. "We'll find her," he assured, placing a steady hand on Catherine's shoulder. "I promise you that." Within hours, the entire police force was mobilized. Search parties formed spontaneously as neighbors, teachers, and classmates gathered with flashlights, combing the streets, the park, and the woods behind the school. What no one could possibly know was that Emily Reynolds had vanished completely like a raindrop in an ocean, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Springfield for nearly 2 decades. And the man who had promised to find her? He drove home that night, parked his cruiser in his garage, and carefully locked a small pink diary in his basement safe before washing Emily's blood from his hands. The next morning, Springfield awoke to the unfamiliar sight of news vans parked along Main Street. The disappearance of a teenage girl, particularly one as well-liked and promising as Emily Reynolds, sent ripples of fear through the previously peaceful community. Catherine sat rigid at her kitchen table, eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, clutching a school photo of Emily between trembling fingers. Jason paced the living room, his face a mask of helpless anger. "Mrs. Reynolds," Sheriff Harrington said as he settled into the chair across from her, "I need to ask you some difficult questions." His voice carried the weight of practiced authority, firm yet compassionate. "Anything," Catherine whispered. "Just find my daughter." "Has Emily ever run away before? Any fights recently? Boy troubles?" The questions came methodically as deputies Collins and Martinez took notes nearby. Catherine shook her head firmly. "Never. Emily's not the type. She's responsible, focused on her future. We talked about everything." Jason stopped pacing. "Sheriff, you should know that Emily's been keeping a diary. She writes in it every night. It's not with her school things." Harrington's expression remained neutral, but something flickered briefly in his eyes that could be very helpful. "Mind if we check her room?" Emily's bedroom told the story of a life suspended in mid-sentence. Posters of Whitney Houston and Janet Jackson adorned lavender walls. A half-finished English essay sat on her desk next to a framed photo of Emily with her mother and brother at Cape Cod last summer. Books were neatly arranged on shelves. Emily loved mysteries and poetry, but despite a thorough search, no diary was found. "Maybe she had it with her," Deputy Collins suggested. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need a list of all her friends, activities, anyone who might have seen her yesterday." The investigation proceeded with textbook precision. Search parties expanded their radius. Flyers with Emily's smiling face appeared in shop windows, on telephone poles, and at bus stops. Local news ran the story nightly. The FBI sent an agent to assist, bringing with them the grim expertise of those who had seen too many missing children cases. 3 days after Emily's disappearance, Melissa Anderson approached Catherine after a community meeting. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said hesitantly, "there's something I didn't tell the police because I wasn't sure if it mattered." She glanced nervously at the officers across the room. Emily mentioned a couple times that she felt like someone was watching her when she walked home. She thought maybe she was being paranoid. Catherine's blood ran cold. "Did she say who?" Melissa shook her head. No, just that she sometimes noticed the same car. I told her to take a different route, but Emily, she said she wasn't going to let some creep scare her. This new information sent investigators down fresh avenues. They interviewed school staff, checking for any unusual interest in Emily. They questioned known sex offenders in neighboring counties. They scrutinized security camera footage from businesses along Emily's route home. Sheriff Harrington personally oversaw every aspect of the investigation, working tirelessly, often staying at the station past midnight. The community admired his dedication. "If it were my daughter," he told reporters, "I'd want law enforcement moving heaven and earth. That's what we're doing for Emily." Behind closed doors, the investigation began hitting walls. No witnesses had seen Emily after she left school grounds. No evidence suggested she'd been taken by force. The FBI profiler developed theories, perhaps a careful predator who had been watching her, or someone she knew and trusted enough to approach willingly. As weeks passed, hope began to waver. Catherine refused to give up, appearing on regional news programs, pleading for information. Jason deferred his college classes to help with the search. The community rallied around them with fundraisers, prayer vigils, and volunteer search efforts. Sheriff Harrington remained a constant presence, checking in with Catherine daily, organizing new search efforts when tips came in, assuring her that cases like Emily's could break open with a single piece of information. "We're not giving up," he promised Catherine one evening, 6 weeks after Emily vanished. They sat on her porch, the October chill requiring jackets. Not ever. Catherine studied his face, the lines of fatigue, the determined set of his jaw. "I believe you, Sheriff." What Catherine couldn't see was what happened after Harrington left her home. The careful drive to the isolated cabin he owned 30 miles outside town, the small, locked room with soundproofed walls, the methodical way he reviewed his journals, documenting his obsession with teenage girls that stretched back years before Emily caught his attention. By Christmas, Emily's case had cooled significantly. The FBI redirected resources to more recent disappearances. Local officers returned to routine patrols. The news vans departed. Only Catherine, Jason, and a small circle of dedicated friends maintained the increasingly lonely vigil. Sheriff Harrington arranged for a memorial bench to be placed outside Lincoln High School the following spring. The plaque read, "In memory of Emily Reynolds, forever in our hearts." The gesture earned him tearful gratitude from Catherine and community-wide acclaim for his compassion. No one suspected that the man comforting Emily's mother knew exactly where the missing girl had taken her last breath, or that he slept soundly each night, his sterling reputation as a dedicated public servant growing even as Emily's memory began to fade from public consciousness. Only Emily's diary held the truth hidden where no one would think to look for the next 19 years. October 2013 arrived in Springfield with the same golden-leaved splendor as that fateful autumn 19 years earlier. The town had changed, expanded shopping centers, new housing developments, a renovated downtown area, but beneath the veneer of progress, Emily Reynolds' disappearance remained an unhealed wound in the community's collective memory. Catherine Reynolds had aged well beyond her 57 years. Grief had carved permanent lines around her eyes and mouth, though she'd managed to rebuild some semblance of a life. She volunteered at the local crisis center, counseling families of missing children, channeling her pain into purpose. Her hair had gone completely silver, worn in a simple bob that framed a face that rarely smiled. Jason Reynolds, now 38, had become an attorney specializing in cases involving missing persons and victims' rights. His Springfield office walls displayed his law degree alongside a fading photo of Emily. He'd married and had 2 daughters, the oldest named Emily after the aunt she would never meet. Sheriff William Harrington had risen to even greater prominence in the community. At 61, he was now serving his 6th term, widely respected for his unwavering commitment to Springfield's safety. Silver-haired and distinguished, he often mentioned the Reynolds case in interviews as the one that haunts me most, the case we could never solve. His devotion to finding justice for Emily had become part of his legend. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Catherine's phone rang while she was preparing for her volunteer shift. "Mrs. Reynolds? This is Detective Michaels from Springfield PD." The young officer's voice held an unfamiliar urgency. "I need to speak with you in person. It's about Emily." Catherine's hand clutched the counter edge. 19 years of false hopes and dead ends had taught her to expect nothing, yet her heart raced traitorously. "I'll be right there." At the station, Detective Sarah Michaels, a woman who had been just a child when Emily disappeared, led Catherine to a conference room where Jason was already waiting, his expression unreadable. 3 days ago, Michaels began. A construction crew started renovations on the old Whitaker house on Elm Street, about 2 blocks from Lincoln High. She placed a photograph on the table. While removing part of the wall in the attic, they found this. Catherine stared at the image of a small pink diary, its cover faded but still bearing the unmistakable silver lock. Emily had been so proud of when Catherine had given it to her for her 14th birthday. "We've confirmed it's Emily's," Michaels continued gently. "The handwriting matches her school assignments we still had on file." Jason leaned forward. What does it say? Detective Michaels hesitated. Mrs. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds. The contents are disturbing. Emily documented that she was being followed. She was afraid but didn't want to worry you. Her eyes met Catherine's. She identified her stalker in the final entries. Catherine's voice emerged as barely a whisper. Who, Sheriff Harrington? The silence that followed seemed to stretch into infinity. Jason was the first to break it, his attorney's mind already racing. That's impossible. Harrington led the investigation. He's been with the department for decades. The diary contains details only Emily could have known, Michaels replied. Dates, times, descriptions of his patrol car following her. In her last entry, dated September 15, 1994, the day she disappeared, she wrote that she planned to confront him about it after school. Catherine's world tilted on its axis. The man who had held her hand through her darkest hours, who had promised to never stop looking, who had comforted her while her daughter's case went cold, that same man might have been responsible all along. We've reopened the investigation, Michaels continued. The diary alone isn't enough for an arrest, but it gives us probable cause for search warrants. We're proceeding carefully given Harrington's position. The next 48 hours unfolded like a fever dream. Springfield buzzed with rumors as FBI agents arrived and search warrants were executed at Harrington's home and his cabin in the woods. Reporters camped outside the police station. Catherine and Jason retreated to her home, blinds drawn, phones silenced. On the third day, Detective Michaels returned with news that would shatter Springfield's foundations. We found physical evidence at Harrington's cabin, she said, her professional composure barely masking her disgust. Hidden compartments beneath the floorboards contained personal effects from multiple victims, including Emily's bracelet and necklace. She paused. And we found human remains on the property. DNA testing would later confirm what Catherine somehow already knew. Her daughter had never left Springfield alive. William Harrington was arrested that evening at his office, the station swarming with FBI agents and state police to ensure the process went smoothly. The town watched in disbelief as the man they had trusted for decades was led away in handcuffs, his face impassive. The investigation uncovered the horrifying truth piece by piece. Harrington had been a predator hiding in plain sight, using his position to stalk vulnerable young girls. Emily had not been his first victim, but her diary, the one piece of evidence he hadn't destroyed, would ensure she would be his last. He kept my diary as a trophy, Catherine whispered to Jason as they sat in her living room the night after Harrington's arrest. Outside, news vans lined the street. All these years, while he pretended to care, while he sat right here in this house, Jason took his mother's hand. The attorney in him wanted to discuss the strength of the case, the forensic evidence, the likelihood of multiple charges spanning decades. But the brother in him could only think of Emily Bright, brave Emily, who had documented her own stalking, creating evidence that would ultimately bring her killer to justice, even if it took 19 years. She helped solve her own murder, Mom, he said softly. Even then she was fighting. Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. That sounds like our Emily. As Springfield reeled from the revelations as other families came forward with suspicions about missing girls from neighboring counties. As the case against William Harrington grew stronger by the day, Emily's diary became both evidence and testimony, the voice of a 15-year-old girl, finally being heard across a chasm of 19 years. And in her small pink bedroom, preserved exactly as she had left it that September morning in 1994, the truth Emily had tried to tell had finally found its way home. The courthouse in downtown Springfield had stood since 1892, its imposing granite facade weathered by more than a century of New England seasons. On this December morning in 2013, it faced perhaps its most significant trial, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus William Harrington. The preliminary hearings had riveted the nation. A sheriff, a man of the law, charged with the murder of Emily Reynolds and suspected in the disappearances of 4 other girls across 3 counties. The media descended upon Springfield like locusts, transforming the quiet town into a circus of satellite trucks and reporters delivering breathless updates. Against the backdrop of snow-dusted colonial architecture, Catherine Reynolds sat in the front row of the courtroom, her back straight, her gaze never leaving the side door through which Harrington would enter. Jason sat beside her, holding a legal pad, though he wasn't part of the prosecution team. His presence was purely personal, Reynolds facing the monster who had destroyed their family. The courtroom doors opened, admitting a stream of Springfield residents. Many had known Emily, some had participated in the searches, all had trusted William Harrington. All rise, announced the bailiff as Judge Eleanor Winters entered, her black robes billowing slightly as she took her seat at the bench. When William Harrington was led in, shackled and wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his familiar uniform, a collective murmur rippled through the gallery. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his badge and gun. His silver hair had been cropped short in county lockup, and a week's worth of stubble peppered his once immaculate jaw. Only his eyes remained unchanged, cold, calculating, revealing nothing as they swept across the courtroom and momentarily locked with Catherine's. District Attorney Rebecca Chun approached the podium. At 43, she had built her career on difficult cases, but none had carried the weight of this one. You murder! The Commonwealth seeks to try the defendant for first-degree murder in the death of Emily Reynolds, with additional charges to follow as our investigation into other disappearances continues. Judge Winters nodded. Mr. Harrington, how do you plead? Defense attorney James Moretti stood. Not guilty, Your Honor. The simple words sent a visible shudder through Catherine's body. Jason placed a steadying hand on her arm. What followed was the clinical dissection of Emily's last day alive, now illuminated by her diary entries and the physical evidence recovered from Harrington's properties. The prosecution methodically built their case in the pretrial hearing, laying groundwork for the trial to come. Emily's diary entries began noting a patrol car following her approximately 2 months before her disappearance. Dia Chun explained, projecting pages from the diary onto a screen. Emily's neat handwriting filled the courtroom with her voice from beyond the grave. April 12, 1994. Noticed the same police car on my way home again today. 3rd time this week. Probably nothing but weird. May 3rd, 1994, the police car was there again. Drove really slow past me. Pretty sure it was Sheriff Harrington. Why would he be watching me? June 17, 1994, told Melissa about the sheriff following me. She thinks I should tell Mom, but Mom has enough to worry about with work and bills. Besides, he's the sheriff. Who would believe me? The entries continued, growing more frequent and increasingly concerned throughout the summer. By September, Emily's fear was palpable. September 10, 1994, he was parked outside school today, just sitting there. When I walked past, he smiled and waved like it was normal. I'm going to start taking different routes home. September 14, 1994. Found a note in my locker today. It said, I see you trying to avoid me. No signature. I'm scared, but I can't keep living like this. Tomorrow I'm going to confront him and tell him to leave me alone, or I'll tell everyone. If something happens to me, it was Sheriff Harrington. The final entry, dated September 15, 1994, was the last thing Emily Reynolds ever wrote. Today's the day. After school, I'm going to demand he stop following me. Mom always says to stand up to bullies. I'll update tonight with what happens. There was no update. According to the prosecution's timeline, reconstructed from witness statements and forensic evidence, Emily had indeed confronted Harrington that afternoon. He had offered her a ride to discuss her concerns. Instead, he had driven her to his cabin, where he eventually killed her. Forensic analysis of soil samples taken from beneath the cabin floorboards contains DNA matching Emily Reynolds, Chun stated. Additionally, fibers from the clothing she was wearing on the day of her disappearance were found in the defendant's former patrol vehicle, preserved in the county's retired fleet warehouse. Throughout the presentation, Harrington remained expressionless, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorney. The man who had built a career on projecting authority now seemed almost bored by the proceedings that would determine whether he lived or died. During a brief recess, Catherine stepped into the hallway for air, the weight of Emily's final words pressing against her chest. Jason followed, his face ashen. Mom, he said quietly, there's something you should know before it comes out in court. He hesitated. The FBI found journals in Harrington's basement safe. He kept detailed records. Catherine's eyes closed briefly. Of Emily? Of Emily? And others. Jason swallowed hard. He wrote about attending the searches, about comforting you, about how much he enjoyed playing the role of concerned sheriff while knowing exactly what had happened. A cold fury crystallized in Catherine's heart. For 19 years, she had invited this man into her home, accepted his sympathy, thanked him for his dedication, all while he secretly relished her pain. When court resumed, more evidence was presented: hair fibers, soil analysis, testimony from the construction workers who found the diary. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt, suggesting the diary could have been planted, questioning the reliability of forensic evidence stored for nearly 2 decades. But the most damning evidence came from Harrington himself. In his own meticulous journals, he had documented not only Emily's murder, but his calculated efforts to control the investigation, to destroy evidence, to misdirect other officers. He had recorded in clinical detail how he had stalked Emily for months before finally acting, how her attempts to vary her route home had become part of the game for him. The defendant didn't just commit murder, De Chun told the court. He weaponized his badge to do it, then used that same authority to ensure he would never be caught. As the hearing concluded and the judge set a trial date, Catherine found herself staring at Harrington's back as he was led away. The monster who had taken her daughter had been hiding in the uniform of the man promising to find her. The irony was as cruel as it was complete. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as Catherine and Jason descended the steps. One voice rose above the others. Mrs. Reynolds, how does it feel knowing Sheriff Harrington was investigating his own crime? Before Jason could intervene, Catherine turned to face the cameras, her voice steady and clear, despite the tears in her eyes. For 19 years, I thanked the man who murdered my daughter for trying to find her. There's no word in any language for that kind of betrayal. As the media swarmed and flashbulbs popped, Catherine Reynolds became the face of a parent's worst nightmare and of a strength that would see justice done, no matter how delayed. January in Massachusetts brought bitter cold, and the trial of William Harrington. National news networks set up permanent encampments outside the Springfield courthouse, their coverage framing the case as both a tragic murder and a catastrophic breach of public trust. Legal experts debated the evidence on primetime specials. True crime podcasts dissected Emily's diary entries. Springfield itself had become synonymous with betrayal of the most fundamental kind. Catherine had stopped watching television altogether. The constant rehashing of Emily's final moments, often speculative and sensationalized, was more than she could bear. Instead, she focused on preparing for her testimony, reviewing her memories of interactions with Harrington during those 19 years, each recollection now poised by knowledge of his true nature. On the third day of trial, Catherine took the stand. The courtroom was completely silent as she was sworn in, every eye fixed on the silver-haired woman whose composure seemed both miraculous and heartbreaking. Mrs. Reynolds began to chun gently. "Could you tell the court about your daughter, Emily?" Catherine's gaze drifted momentarily to the large portrait of Emily the prosecution had placed on an easel 15 forever, her school photo smile frozen in time. "Emily was extraordinary in the most ordinary ways," she said, her voice steady. "Straight A student, loved poetry and volleyball. It's always stood up for kids who were bullied." A small, sad smile crossed her face. "She left notes in my lunch bag when I worked double shifts. You've got this, Mom." That was Emily. "And after her disappearance, how often did you interact with the defendant, William Harrington?" Catherine's eyes shifted to Harrington, who stared back impassively. "Almost daily at first, then weekly, then monthly as the case went cold. For years after, he would check in on anniversaries of her disappearance. He attended the dedication of her memorial bench at the high school. He gave speeches about never giving up. And during these interactions, did Sheriff Harrington ever give you any reason to suspect his involvement?" "Never." The word hung in the air. "He was..." Catherine paused, searching for the right words. "He was our rock. The whole town's rock. The person we believed was working hardest to find Emily." Dachu nodded solemnly. "What went through your mind when you learned about Emily's diary and the evidence against Sheriff Harrington?" Defense attorney Moretti rose. "Objection. Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Chung countered. "Mrs. Reynolds, what was your reaction to learning the defendant was implicated in your daughter's disappearance?" Catherine's composure wavered slightly. "I vomited. Then I sat on my bathroom floor for hours, remembering every conversation, every reassurance, every moment I had thanked him for his help." Her voice hardened. "I remembered how he held my hand at the memorial service we held on the one-year anniversary, how he told me not to lose hope, all while knowing exactly what he had done to her." Throughout her testimony, Catherine never raised her voice or shed a tear. Her quiet dignity seemed to affect the jury more profoundly than any dramatic display of emotion could have. When defense attorney Moretti rose for cross-examination, his approach was noticeably gentle. "Mrs. F. Reynolds, first let me express my sincere condolences for your loss." Moretti's tactical sympathy felt hollow in the charged atmosphere. "In the 19 years following Emily's disappearance, did Sheriff Harrington ever behave inappropriately toward you or express any unusual interest in the case?" "Define unusual," Catherine replied, a flash of steel in her voice. "Was it unusual that he kept Emily's missing person flyer on his desk for years?" "At the time, I found it comforting. Now I understand it was a trophy." Moretti tried a different approach. "During the initial investigation, was there anyone else you suspected might have been involved in Emily's disappearance?" "No," Catherine answered, "because the person who should have been our primary suspect was the one running the investigation." By the time Catherine was excused from the stand, the emotional temperature in the courtroom had risen palpably. Several jurors were openly wiping away tears. Even Judge Winters seemed affected, her usual brisk manner softened. Jason testified next, describing his experience as Emily's older brother and the impact of her disappearance on his life. He recounted Harrington's frequent assurances and apparent dedication to the case. "He looked me in the eye countless times and promised we'd find answers," Jason said, his attorney's composure momentarily cracking. Meanwhile, he was going home each night, probably looking at her possessions, knowing exactly what he'd done. The prosecution methodically built their case over the following days. Forensic experts explained how soil samples containing DNA had been preserved beneath the cabin floorboards despite Harrington's efforts to sanitize the scene. FBI analysts testified about the other trophies found hidden in his home, items belonging to other missing girls from neighboring counties. The diary itself was presented with painstaking authentication. Forensic document examiners confirmed it was indeed Emily's handwriting, matching samples from her school assignments. Materials experts dated the ink and paper to 1994. Construction workers testified about finding it hidden in the wall cavity of the attic in the old Whitaker House property that investigation revealed had briefly belonged to Harrington's cousin in the mid-1990s before being sold to a succession of owners unaware of what was hidden within their walls. The defendant needed to preserve the diary, DeChun explained to the jury. It was both a trophy and insurance, hidden where it would likely never be found. but accessible if he ever needed to plant it to frame someone else if suspicion turned toward him. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from retired Deputy Collins, who had worked under Harrington during the original investigation. Now in his 70s and battling cancer, Collins had come forward after Harrington's arrest with disturbing recollections. There were leads Sheriff Harrington steered us away from, Collins testified. Oxygen tubes in his nose and regret etched on his face. A witness reported seeing a police cruiser near where Emily was last seen. Harrington dismissed it, said it was Officer Peterson on regular patrol. I noted it in the file, but it was removed the next day. And did you question this at the time? Chun asked. Collins shook his head slowly. He was the sheriff. We trusted him completely. He looked toward Catherine. I'm sorry. We should have seen it. Throughout the prosecution's case, Harrington remained stoic. OCCASIONALLY, writing notes to his attorney but showing no reaction to even the most incriminating evidence. His detachment seemed to disturb the jury more than any display of emotion would have. When the defense began their case, they faced an uphill battle against the mountain of evidence. Moretti focused on creating reasonable doubt, suggesting the diary could have been written after Emily's disappearance, possibly by someone trying to frame Harrington. He called character witnesses, former colleagues and community members who attested to Harrington's reputation as a dedicated officer. But these testimonials withered under cross-examination as Chun forced each witness to confront the physical evidence against their former sheriff. One by one, they left the stand shaken, their certainty replaced by horrible doubt. Outside the courthouse each evening, Catherine faced the waiting cameras with quiet dignity. She had become unwillingly a symbol of both unimaginable tragedy and extraordinary resilience. All I want, she told the reporter as the trial entered its second week, is for the truth about Emily to be known. She was brave enough to write down what was happening to her. I need to be brave enough to see this through for her. The truth, buried for 19 years, was finally emerging into the light, one testimony, one piece of evidence, one journal entry at a time. On the morning William Harrington was scheduled to testify in his own defense, Springfield awoke to 6 inches of fresh snow. The courthouse steps had been cleared by maintenance workers long before dawn, creating a stark white corridor through which the day's participants would pass. Legal experts had debated whether Harrington would take the stand at all. Many defendants in his position, facing overwhelming physical evidence, chose silence over potentially damaging testimony. But James Moretti had hinted to reporters that his client would indeed speak, suggesting the former sheriff had compelling explanations that would contextualize the evidence. Catherine and Jason arrived early, navigating through the media gauntlet with practiced stoicism. Inside, they took their usual seats in the front row. Over the past 2 weeks, they had developed a grim routine coffee from the courthouse cafe, brief acknowledging nods to the prosecutors, and the steeling of nerves for another day of painful revelations. Are you ready for this? Jason asked softly, his hand covering his mother's. Catherine nodded. I've waited 19 years to hear him explain himself. Judge Winters called the court to order precisely at 9 a.m. After addressing several procedural matters, she turned to the defense. Mr. Moretti, call your next witness. Moretti stood. The defense calls William Harrington. A ripple of tension coursed through the courtroom as Harrington rose from the defense table. Even in prison-issued clothing, he maintained the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. He was sworn in, his eye due clear and unwavering. Mr. Harrington, Moretti began after establishing his client's lengthy law enforcement credentials. Did you kill Emily Reynolds? I did not, Harrington replied, his voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom. Did you stalk Emily Reynolds in the months before her disappearance? No, I did not. How do you explain Emily's diary entries specifically naming you as following her? Harrington's expression remained impassive. I was the sheriff of a small town. My patrol routes regularly took me past the high school and through residential neighborhoods, including Emily's. She may have misinterpreted routine patrols as something sinister. And the forensic evidence found at your cabin? That cabin has been in my family for generations. Dozens of people have had access to it over the years, including other officers during department retreats. Anyone could have planted that evidence. For nearly an hour, Moretti led Harrington through carefully crafted explanations for each piece of evidence. The journals found in his safe, creative writing exercises recommended by my therapist to process difficult cases. The items belonging to missing girls, evidence I kept secure when I suspected departmental leaks. The soil samples with Emily's DNA, completely fabricated or contaminated after years of improper storage. Throughout his direct examination, Harrington's demeanor remained measured and professional, the trusted lawman explaining away a terrible misunderstanding. He expressed appropriate sympathy for the Reynolds family and righteous indignation at being falsely accused. To casual observers, he might have seemed convincing, but the jury had spent 2 weeks immersed in the horrific details of the case. They had seen the evidence, heard from forensic experts, read Emily's increasingly desperate diary entries. They had watched Catherine Reynolds relive her daughter's disappearance and the shattering revelation of betrayal. and now they watched Harrington's performance with increasingly skeptical expressions. When Da-Chun rose for cross-examination, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. "Mr. Harrington," she began, "you've had a distinguished career in law enforcement, correct?" "Yes, I have. 37 years with the Springfield Sheriff's Department. 6 terms as elected sheriff. Numerous commendations and awards." "That's correct." Chun nodded. "So you're familiar with evidence collection protocols, chain of custody requirements, and forensic investigative techniques?" "Very familiar, yes. In fact, you taught seminars on these subjects at the Regional Police Academy?" "I did." Chun approached with a document. "This is a transcript from one such seminar you conducted in 2002. You stated, and I quote, 'Physical evidence doesn't lie, people lie, witnesses lie, sometimes even victims lie. But DNA, fiber evidence, soil samples, they tell the truth every time.' Do you stand by that statement?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Harrington's face. "Generally speaking, yes. But evidence can be mishandled or misinterpreted. Like the evidence in Emily Reynolds' case?" Chun's voice hardened. "Evidence that you personally oversaw the collection and storage of?" "I supervised the investigation. Deputies handled the actual evidence." Chun changed tack abruptly. "Let's discuss your journals, Mr. Harrington. You claim they were therapeutic exercises, yet they contain details about Emily Reynolds' final moments that only her killer would know. Details that were never released to the public. As I said, I processed difficult cases through writing exercises. I imagined scenarios based on my investigative experience." "Really?" Chun produced another document. "This is an excerpt from your journal dated September 16, 1994, one day after Emily disappeared. You wrote, 'Her bracelet broke when I grabbed her wrist. Beads scattered on the cabin floor. I'll need to find them all.' The bracelet was a gift from her mother with distinctive handmade beads." Chun approached the evidence table and lifted a small evidence bag. "These beads were found beneath your cabin floorboards, along with soil containing Emily's DNA. How did you imagine the exact details of a bracelet that wasn't mentioned in any police report?" Harrington's composure slipped momentarily. "I must have observed her wearing it previously." "Mr. Harrington, did you know the Whitaker house on Elm Street?" The abrupt change in questioning seemed to catch him off guard. "My cousin owned it briefly in the 1990s. I helped him with some renovations, including work in the attic. Possibly. It was a long time ago." Chun nodded to her assistant, who displayed a property record on the courtroom screens. "Your cousin purchased the house in October 1994, 1 month after Emily disappeared. You helped with renovations in November 1994, according to his statement to investigators." She paused. "Convenient timing for hiding a diary that implicated you, wouldn't you say?" "Objection," Moretti called. "Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Winters ruled. Chun continued relentlessly, methodically dismantling each of Harrington's explanations with documentary evidence, witness statements, and forensic reports. As the cross-examination stretched into its second hour, Harrington's confident demeanor began to erode, replaced by terse answers and visible irritation. The breaking point came when Chun projected pages from his personal journals onto the courtroom screen, not the ones found in his safe, but private journals recovered from a hidden compartment in his bedroom wall. "These entries span 19 years, Mr. Harrington. They document your annual ritual of visiting the site where you buried evidence of your crimes on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance. They detail how you manipulated the investigation. They record your private thoughts about Catherine Reynolds and how much you enjoyed, in your words, playing the grieving sheriff while she remained oblivious." Chun's voice was ice. "Are these therapeutic exercises as well?" Harrington stared at his own handwriting displayed for all to see. For the first time, genuine emotion crossed his face, not remorse, but fury at being exposed. "You had no right to those," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The search warrant gave us every right," Chun replied, "just as Emily Reynolds had every right to live past her 10th birthday." The gallery remained deathly silent as Harrington's facade finally cracked. His eyes darted around the courtroom, lingering momentarily on Catherine. There was no pretense of innocence now, only cold calculation. "You think you understand what happened," he said, addressing Chun but looking at Catherine. "You have no idea. She was special, different from the others. She noticed me watching when no one else did. She was going to expose everything." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Moretti's head dropped into his hands. Several jurors gasped audibly. Judge Winters leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mr. Harrington," she said carefully, "I advise you to consult with your attorney before continuing." But something had broken loose in William. Harrington, some dam of self-preservation crumbling after years of maintaining his public persona. 19 years, he continued, ignoring his frantically gesturing attorney. "I protected this town for 19 years while hiding what needed to be hidden. I was a good sheriff. Ask anyone. Better than most. One mistake shouldn't erase all that." "One mistake?" Catherine's voice cut through the courtroom, though she hadn't raised it. "You murdered my daughter." Harrington turned to her fully now. 19 years of secrets finally spilling forth. She wouldn't stop, wouldn't listen. I only wanted to scare her at first, make her understand the consequences of threatening me. Things escalated. Judge Winters banged her gavel sharply. That's enough. Bailiff, please remove the jury. Mr. Moretti, control your client. As the stunned jurors filed out, Catherine remained perfectly still, her eyes locked with the man who had taken everything from her and then pretended to help her pick up the pieces. In that moment of terrible clarity, justice delayed but not denied had finally begun its reckoning. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. After Harrington's damning outburst, Judge Winters had declared a recess, during which Moretti desperately attempted to mitigate the damage. When court reconvened, Harrington had regained his composure, and Moretti moved for a mistrial, arguing his client's statements were made under duress and without proper counsel. Judge Winters denied the motion. The defendant's statements were voluntary and not in response to any improper questioning, she ruled. The jury will be instructed to consider all evidence presented, including the defendant's testimony. In her closing argument, Dia Chun didn't need to belabor the obvious. She simply replayed the courtroom video of Harrington's confession, letting his own words seal his fate. Moretti's closing, by contrast, felt perfunctory, a professional obligation rather than a genuine defense. When the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict, Catherine and Jason returned to the courtroom, hands clasped tightly together. News of the imminent verdict had spread rapidly, and the gallery was packed to capacity. Outside, a crowd had gathered in the courthouse square despite the bitter January cold, watching live feeds on their phones. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Winters instructed. Harrington stood alongside Moretti, his expression once again carefully blank. The momentary crack in his facade sealed over. The jury foreman, a retired school principal, handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Winters. After reviewing it briefly, she returned it to the bailiff. "In the matter of the Commonwealth versus William Harrington, on the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find?" The foreman's voice was clear and steady. "We find the defendant guilty." A collective exhalation seemed to ripple through the courtroom. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders dropping as if a physical weight had been lifted. Jason put his arm around her, his own face a mixture of vindication and lingering grief. Harrington showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening of his jaw. The man who had hidden his true nature for decades maintained his performance to the bitter end. Judge Winters scheduled sentencing for the following month and ordered Harrington remanded to custody. As he was led away, he turned slightly, his eyes meeting Catherine's one final time. There was no remorse there, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed, only cold assessment, as if even now he was calculating odds and angles. Outside the courthouse, Catherine faced the wall of cameras with Jason at her side. For 19 years, she had lived with unanswered questions. Now, with justice finally served, reporters wanted her reaction, her relief, her closure, her plans for moving forward. "The truth about what happened to Emily has finally come to light," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "But there is no victory here, only accountability that came far too late. Emily should be 34 years old today. She should have had a life." As February brought sentencing proceedings, Springfield attempted to process the collective trauma of Harrington's betrayal. The town had trusted him completely, elevated him to a position of respect and authority, while he had preyed on the most vulnerable and manipulated those who grieved. Community forums were held to address the sense of violation and broken trust. The sheriff's department, now under new leadership, underwent a complete review of old cases Harrington had supervised. On a gray morning with snow falling gently outside the courtroom windows, William Harrington stood before Judge Winters for sentencing. The proceeding was brief compared to the trial, but no less momentous. Before the judge announced her decision, Catherine was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement. She approached the podium carrying a worn, leather-bound book. "This is not Emily's diary," she began, her fingers tracing the cover. "That remains in evidence. This is my diary, started the day after Emily disappeared." She opened it to a marked page. "I wrote this entry on September 18, 1994. Sheriff Harrington came by again today. He brought coffee and sat with me at the kitchen table, promising they're following every lead. I trust him completely. If anyone can find Emily, he will." Catherine looked up, meeting Harrington's eyes directly. "For 19 years I wrote about your kindness, your dedication, your compassion. I thanked God for sending such a good man to help us through our darkest time." Her voice remained steady. "Now I understand it was all an elaborate performance. You didn't just take my daughter's life. You took my trust, my faith in humanity, my ability to believe in the goodness of others." She closed the diary carefully. "But you didn't take everything. Emily left behind more than you could destroy. Her courage in documenting what was happening to her, her determination to stand up to you even when it cost her life, her spirit that somehow reached across 19 years to finally bring you to justice." Catherine returned to her seat without another word. The courtroom remained utterly silent until Judge Winters spoke. "William Harrington, you have been found guilty of the first-degree murder of Emily Reynolds. This court also acknowledges the substantial evidence of your involvement in other disappearances. which may result in additional charges. The judge's voice was measured but carried unmistakable condemnation. You committed the most profound violation of public trust possible. You used your position not only to commit murder but to control the investigation and ensure your crimes remained hidden. You exploited the grief of a community for your own protection and, it seems, your own gratification. Judge Winters paused, looking directly at the former sheriff. I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will serve your sentence at the maximum security facility at Cedar Junction. As Harrington was led away for the final time, the chapter of his freedom closed definitively. But for Catherine, Jason, and Springfield itself, a new chapter was just beginning, one of healing from a betrayal so profound it had altered the very foundation of their community. In the days following the sentencing, Catherine received hundreds of letters from Springfield residents expressing their sorrow, their shame at having trusted Harrington, and their admiration for her strength. Former deputies who had worked under Harrington wrote painful apologies for not seeing what was happening. Families of other missing girls reached out, hoping Harrington's files might finally provide answers about their loved ones. The old Whitaker house, where Emily's diary had remained hidden for nearly 2 decades, became an unofficial memorial site. People left flowers on the sidewalk, notes of remembrance, tokens of respect for a 15-year-old girl whose written words had eventually brought her killer to justice. One evening, a week after the sentencing, Catherine sat at her kitchen table with Emily's diary, which had been returned to her now that the trial was complete. The small pink book with its broken lock contained both heartbreak and vindication. Emily's final entries showed a young woman facing genuine terror but determined to confront it, a courage that transcended her brief life. Jason arrived with dinner, finding his mother carefully turning the pages of the diary. "Mom," he said gently, setting down the takeout bags. "Are you sure you want to read that again?" Catherine nodded. "I need to. Not the ending. I know the ending too well. But the beginning, the middle. The parts where she was just Emily, my Emily, writing about school and friends and dreams." She looked up at her son. "For 19 years, I remembered her disappearance more clearly than her life. I don't want that anymore." As they shared a quiet dinner, Catherine realized that while justice had finally been served, her journey was far from over. The truth about Emily's fate had been unearthed, but the process of reclaiming Emily's life, of remembering her not just as a victim but as the vibrant, determined girl she had been, was just beginning. And somewhere in that process lay the possibility, however distant, of peace. Spring arrived in Springfield with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic for the harsh winter that had preceded it. Crocuses pushed through the last patches of snow, and the maple trees lining Harrison Street, the same street Emily had walked down on her final day, budded with the promise of new leaves. Catherine Reynolds stood at her kitchen window watching the transformation of her small backyard. She had begun gardening again recently, something she had loved before. Emily's disappearance, but had abandoned in the years of searching and grieving. Now freshly turned soil awaited the seedlings on her countertop, marigolds, zinnias, and Emily's favorite snapdragons. The months following Harrington's sentencing had brought both closure and new beginnings. The FBI had formed a task force dedicated to reviewing all the evidence from Harrington's home, cabin, and office. Their meticulous work had already linked him to 3 other disappearances between 1989 and 2001, young girls whose cases had gone cold. Their families left without answers, just as the Reynolds had been. Catherine had met with these families, forming a painful bond of shared experience. Together they navigated the complex emotions of finally knowing the truth after years of uncertainty. There was relief in answers, but no joy, only the grim confirmation of their worst fears and the knowledge that their loved ones' final moments had been in the hands of a monster who had hidden behind a badge. The media attention had gradually subsided. After the initial frenzy of the trial and sentencing, the news vans had departed. The reporters had moved on to fresher stories, and Springfield had been left to heal in relative privacy. Catherine was grateful for the return to anonymity, though she occasionally gave interviews to support the families of the other victims still seeking closure. A knock at the door pulled Catherine from her thoughts. She opened it to find Detective Sarah Michaels holding a cardboard box. "Mrs. Reynolds," Michaels said with a small smile. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I have something I thought you might want to see." Catherine invited her in, clearing space on the kitchen table. In the months since Harrington's arrest, Michaels had become more than just the detective who had reopened Emily's case. The young officer, now leading the local coordination with the FBI task force, had shown exceptional sensitivity in handling the painful revelations that continued to emerge. "We've been cataloging evidence from the attic where Emily's diary was found," Michaels explained, setting down the box. The construction crew had to remove most of the wall to check for structural damage. Behind another section, they found this. She carefully opened the box and removed a plastic evidence bag containing a small cloth backpack, faded purple with silver stars, the fabric worn at the corners. Catherine's breath caught. Emily's book bag, the one she was carrying when she couldn't finish the sentence. Michaels nodded. "We've processed it for evidence." There's nothing that changes the case against Harrington, but there's something inside I thought you should have. From another evidence bag, she withdrew a sealed envelope, slightly yellowed with age but otherwise intact. Written on the front in Emily's neat handwriting was a single word: Mom. It appears Emily wrote this the day she disappeared, Michael said quietly. We found it in an inside pocket of the backpack. The forensic team has examined it. There are no fingerprints besides Emily's. And the paper and ink date to 1994. Catherine stared at the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She must have written it after deciding to confront Harrington. That's our theory, Michaels agreed. She may have planned to give it to you that evening, or perhaps she wrote it as a precaution. The detective tactfully stepped into the living room, giving Catherine privacy as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded precisely in thirds. Emily's handwriting, familiar and yet somehow more mature than Catherine remembered, filled the page. Dear Mom, if you're reading this, I either gave it to you myself or something has happened to me. I hope it's the first one. I've been trying to handle something on my own, and I realize now that was a mistake. Sheriff Harrington has been following me for months. At first I thought I was imagining things, but now I'm sure. Yesterday he left a note in my locker that scared me. I'm going to confront him after school today and tell him to stop. I'll be clear that if he doesn't, I'm telling you, my teachers, and anyone else who will listen. I know this will worry you, but I need to stand up for myself like you've always taught me. If I don't make it home today, please know this is why. Please know it's not your fault. You've given me the courage to face problems head-on instead of running from them. I love you more than I can say. You are the strongest person I know, and whatever happens, I know you'll be strong enough to handle it. Give Jason a hug for me and tell him he's the best brother ever, even when he's annoying. All my love, Emily Piss. No matter what happens, remember, I'm always with you, even if you can't see me. Catherine pressed the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely down her face. After 19 years, these were Emily's final words to her, not the horrific testimony from the trial. Not the clinical descriptions from forensic reports, but a message of love and courage from daughter to mother. When Michaels returned to the kitchen, Catherine was wiping her eyes, the letter carefully set on the table. She knew the risk she was taking, Catherine said softly, but she faced it anyway. That was Emily, braver than anyone I've ever known. Michaels nodded. She must have hidden the backpack in the attic of the Whitaker house sometime that day, maybe sensing she needed to leave evidence somewhere safe. We believe she may have known the house was vacant and accessible, her friend Melissa's statement mentioned they sometimes used the back porch as a shortcut. So she hid her backpack with the letter, then went to confront Harrington. Catherine mused, the pieces falling into place. She created a trail even then, thinking ahead in case something happened. It appears so, Michaels confirmed. The diary in one hiding place, the backpack with your letter in another. She was remarkably strategic for someone so young and frightened. After Michaels left, Catherine spent hours at the kitchen table reading and rereading Emily's letter. Unlike the diary, which had become evidence in a murder trial, this message was personal, a final connection between mother and daughter across an impossible divide of years and loss. That evening she called Jason and read the letter to him over the phone. His quiet weeping echoed her own emotion. She mentioned me, he said finally, his voice thick. After everything she was facing, she thought to mention me. Of course she did, Catherine replied. You were her hero, Jason. Always. Later, as twilight softened the edges of her garden, Catherine sat on her back porch with a cup of tea and Emily's letter beside her. For 19 years, she had imagined countless scenarios about Emily's final hours, all of them colored by uncertainty, many by despair. Now, finally, she had Emily's own words illuminating those last moments, revealing not just fear, but courage, love, and a wisdom beyond her years. The letter didn't erase the horror of what had happened. Nothing could. But it offered something Catherine had never expected to find, a small measure of peace. Emily had faced her worst fear with the same determination that had characterized her brief life. She had created evidence that eventually brought her killer to justice. And she had left behind words of love that had somehow found their way home against impossible odds. As darkness fell completely, Catherine carefully folded the letter and held it against her heart. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she spoke aloud to her daughter, certain somehow that Emily could hear. I'm proud of you, she whispered into the spring night. So very proud.